The arrogant Idosians mocked the tiny, defenseless puppy, unaware its grizzled human owner was the most lethal mercenary in the sector. Ex-Special Forces operative Jeffrey Green clenched his fists as he watched the burly dock workers snatch up his Yorkshire Terrier Spike by the scruff and dangle him in the air, guffawing. The crowded spaceport terminal fell silent. Zephyr, the hulking Idosian brute leading the group, sneered, "You humans are pathetic, soft and weak, just like this runt." Struggling to control his rage, Jeffrey stepped forward. "Put down my dog." The words hissed through gritted teeth. Zephyr roughly dropped Spike, who scampered behind Jeffrey's feet with a frightened yelp. As the Idosians stalked off laughing, Jeffrey scooped up the shaking puppy. "Don't worry, buddy, we'll see who's laughing soon." Jeffrey was here to meet an Idosian client for a lucrative but dangerous mission. Infamous for their ferocity and brutality, Idosians followed a strict hierarchical social structure, valuing power above all else. Jeffrey would need every ounce of his elite skills to survive this job and escape their savage homeworld alive. The Idosians saw humans as inferior prey, but Jeffrey swore to teach them the folly of underestimating humanity's strength. He would complete the mission no matter the odds. Failure meant death, or worse, living as the Idosians' mocked slave pet. Spike gazed up at him trustingly, as Jeffrey muttered, "Time to show these bastards what happens when they fuck with a human's best friend." Later that day, Jeffrey walked into a seedy dive bar in the rough part of town, Spike tucked securely under his arm. The air was thick with the stench of stale Idosian liquor and cheap pheromone spray. Spike's ears perked up, and he began to squirm excitedly in Jeffrey's grasp, his tiny nose twitching. Jeffrey scanned the room and spotted a cloaked and hooded figure seated alone in a dark corner booth. The figure gestured for Jeffrey to approach, his client. As Jeffrey strode towards the booth, Spike suddenly wriggled free and leaped to the grimy floor. The puppy shot like a furry missile straight at the cloaked Idosian, yapping ferociously. Before Jeffrey could lunge to grab him, Spike zoomed under the booth table. There was a loud yelp of pain and the figure sprang to his feet, hood falling back. Zephyr snarled in rage and agony, Spike dangling from his muscular blue calf by his teeth. The Idosian cursed vehemently in his native tongue, snatching a serrated combat knife from his belt. Spike yelped as Zephyr slashed viciously at him. In a flash, Jeffrey crossed the distance and caught Zephyr's knife hand in a bone-crushing grip, halting the blade a hair's breadth from Spike's head. Spike released his bite and dropped to the floor, scampering behind Jeffrey's legs. Jeffrey and Zephyr glared at each other in a wordless contest of dominance, neither giving an inch. The air crackled with tension. Jeffrey could feel Zephyr's arm trembling with barely restrained violence under his grasp. Zephyr's yellow eyes blazed with humiliated fury. Zephyr hissed through clenched fangs, "I was human before your little vermin attacked me." "After the stunt you pulled in the spaceport, he's got plenty of reason not to like you," Jeffrey retorted evenly. "Now, are we going to talk business like professionals or not?" Silence stretched between them for a long moment. Finally, slowly, Zephyr lowered the knife. Jeffrey released his grip and they both sat, eyeing each other warily. Over the next hour, Zephyr laid out the details of the job. A team of human mercenaries led by Jeffrey was to infiltrate a remote Idosian research facility controlled by a rival clan. Their objective, to steal a mysterious and incredibly valuable alien artifact. The facility was heavily fortified and guarded by dozens of battle-hardened Idosian elites. Even slipping onto the planet undetected would be a deadly challenge. But the payoff Zephyr was offering was astronomical. More credits than Jeffrey had earned in his entire bloody career. Jeffrey listened intently, memorizing every detail. Spike sat alertly by his boots, keeping a distrustful eye on Zephyr. Jeffrey's mind raced. To have any shot at pulling this off, he was going to need to put together a top-notch team. All the old gang, Mac, Riz, Shen, Kara, the best of the best. But Jeffrey had a gut feeling that Spike was going to make this op a whole lot more complicated. A week later, the rusted cargo hauler shuddered as it sliced through the atmosphere on approach to the Idosian spaceport. The control panel rattled in protest under Jeffrey's fingers as he tried to steady their descent. Spike sat strapped into his lap, sporting a custom armored vest that Riz had crafted for him. The old dog was the only member of the team not staring intently at their weapons, prepping for the dangerous mission ahead. Kara slammed a fresh clip into her sidearm. "All right, let's go over the plan one more time. We land, play the part of scrap traders to get through port security, then take the long route through the Badlands to hit the facility's weak side. Quick and quiet." Max snorted incredulously. "Sure, quick and quiet. In and out of one of the most fortified strongholds on this rock with a priceless alien trinket. Should be a cakewalk." Riz growled at him. "Stow that attitude, soldier. This isn't the time for—" A piercing alarm from the console cut him off. The screen flashed red with an incoming hail from an Edosian patrol cruiser. "Sheet," Shen hissed. "How'd they sniff us out so fast?" Jeffrey frowned, mind racing. He tapped the screen to answer. "Put 'em through, Kara." A familiar blue face filled the display, contorted with rage. Zephyr roared so loudly it distorted the audio feed. "Did you really think you could land on our planet without us knowing, humans? We've already alerted the facility. They'll be waiting for you now." Spittle flecked the camera lens. Jeffrey held up his hands placatingly, expression neutral. "Whoa there, Zephyr, relax. We're not here for your job. We picked up another contract that just happens to be on this mudball, too. Pure coincidence, I swear." Zephyr's yellow eyes blazed with fury. "Do you take me for a fool, meatsack? Here is what will happen. You will turn your pathetic ship around this instant and run home with your tail between your legs. In return, I won't blast you out of the sky and take the artifact for myself after I scour it from your charred corpses." Two sleek Edosian fighters dropped into view, taking up flanking positions on either side of the hauler. Jeffrey could feel the team's rising tension, hands tightening on weapons. He glanced out the viewports, lips pressed into a grim line. They were outgunned. No way they'd last in a straight-up dogfight against Edosian ships. Spike whined softly, sensing his stress. Jeffrey clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. Slowly he let out a breath and nodded curtly at Zephyr. Zephyr sneered triumphantly and cut the comlink. Jeffrey stared at the blank screen for a long moment, mind churning. Then he turned to Kara. "Bring us about. Set course for open space, nice and easy." He raised a hand to forestall the other's protests. "Just trust me and get ready." Kara nodded tightly and eased the ship into a slow turn. The Edosian fighters stuck to them like burrs, weapons still charged and locked on. Jeffrey watched the patrol ship growing larger ahead of them. He leaned over to mutter in his co-pilot's ear, "Get ready to pull a crazy Ivan on my mark." Shen's eyes widened, but he nodded gamely. "Aye, aye, Captain." "Mark." Shen killed the main engines and fired the maneuvering thrusters. The hauler lurched sickeningly as it spun 180 degrees to face the opposite direction. As it did, Jeffrey slapped the release on their cargo, the ship's entire stock of space mines. The mines spewed out behind them like a deadly swarm of hornets and flew straight into the path of the pursuing fighters. The Edosians had no time to react. Both ships plowed into the mines and vanished in matching balls of fire. "Ha-ha, yes," Jeffrey crowed. "Choke on that, you Edo bastards." Even as he cheered, the exploding fighters' proximity fuses triggered the mines around the patrol ship. A rippling series of detonations tore into the lightly shielded craft, ripping its hull to shreds. The hauler plunged through the expanding cloud of flame and debris, still flying ass backwards, but now arrowing straight for the planet below. Spike stood on the console, barking his head off and wagging his tail wildly, as if applauding the audacious move. Jeffrey reached out to scratch his ears, grinning fiercely. Riz shook his head, chuckling. "You are one crazy son of a bitch, Green. That was the ballsiest thing I've ever seen." "Zephyr and his goons will be breathing down our necks the whole way now," Mac pointed out grimly. "This shit just got a lot more complicated." Jeffrey nodded, smile fading. The thrill of victory could only last so long. He knew he couldn't trust Zephyr as far as he could throw him. The arrogant Edosian may have hired them for this job, but he was far from an ally. Things were about to get a whole lot messier from here, but now there was no going back. The silvery light of the twin moons cast an eerie glow through the dense forest canopy as Geoffrey and his team forged ahead, the distant bulk of the Edosian facility a looming spectre on the horizon. The 5 battle-hardened humans moved quickly, silently, each step measured, ears straining for any hint of danger in the alien night. Spike trotted alertly at Geoffrey's heels, ears swiveling and nose twitching. At the edge of a small clearing, Geoffrey raised a fist, halting the team in their tracks. Glancing around warily, he reached into a pouch and withdrew a small disc. With a flick of his wrist, the disc expanded into a shimmering holographic map of the facility and surrounding terrain. "All right, listen up," Geoffrey murmured, the translucent blue schematic reflecting in his eyes. "We'll follow this ridgeline to—" Without warning, Spike bolted forward into the clearing, yapping frantically. The mercs whirled as one high-powered rifle snapping up to firing positions. But instead of a platoon of charging Edosians, they saw only Spike pelting headlong after a small rabbit-like creature bounding away in blind panic. "Little idiot's going to give away our position," Mac growled, lowering his weapon. Kara snorted. Guess he thought he finally found something he could take in a fight. Geoffrey opened his mouth to whistle Spike back when the pup skidded to a halt in the center of the clearing. His hackles stood straight up as he began barking even more hysterically than before, this time at a patch of seemingly empty air. Riz frowned. "The hell is he—" Suddenly, the space Spike was barking at shimmered, and 3 hulking figures materialized out of thin air, fully armored Edosians appearing as if conjured by Spike's frenzied warning. Active camouflage. "Shit!" Shen swore, swinging his rifle around. But before any of them could get a shot off, the tree line around the clearing erupted in a hail of searing plasma fire. Bolts stitched the ground, sending clods of earth fountaining. It was an ambush. The Edosians had been lying in wait, invisible, Zephyr no doubt having guessed their route, and they would have blundered straight into it if not for Spike. Instincts honed by 100 firefights, the mercs scattered and dove for the scant protection of tree trunks and boulders. Plasma bolts cracked and sizzled around them. The stink of ozone and scorched vegetation choked the air. Geoffrey hit the ground shoulder first behind a fallen log. He brought his rifle up and began returning fire, the weapon bucking against his shoulder as he sent precise bursts tearing through the foliage. Around him, the rest of the team did the same, the chatter of human weapons joining the whine of Edosian plasma rifles. Caught off guard by the humans' preternatural reflexes, Edosian warriors began tumbling from their perches, screeching and thrashing. In the chaos, Spike bounded back and forth, still barking his head off in alarm. A bolt sizzled past Geoffrey's ear, close enough to scorch his skin. He flinched away, and in that instant saw a plasma bolt strike Spike in the flank. With a pained yelp, the little dog was sent tumbling, leaving a trail of scorched earth. Spike flopped weakly to the ground, legs kicking. He struggled to stand, only to collapse with a whimper. Blind rage, boiling and savage, surged through his veins like magma. He unclipped a bandolier of plasma grenades from his belt and surged to his feet, heedless of the energy bolts whickering around him. Bellowing a wordless war cry, Geoffrey charged straight at the nearest cluster of Edosians. His hands moved in a blur, plucking grenades from the bandolier and hurling them into the tree line with all his strength. The orbs sailed through the air, detonating in rippling waves of searing blue-white light, sending charred Edosian body parts pinwheeling. Geoffrey's mercs rallied around him, pouring out of cover with guns blazing. Under the onslaught, the Edosian ambush crumbled. Geoffrey hurled his last grenade and watched grimly as it atomized the final attacker in a cloud of crackling plasma. The silence that descended on the clearing was deafening. Oily black smoke curled from the burning undergrowth, and the scorched craters pocking the earth. The air reeked of cooked meat. Geoffrey barely noticed. He sprinted to where Spike lay crumpled and knelt beside him, heedless of the smouldering Edosian corpses littering the ground around them. Gently, he gathered the little dog into his arms. To his immense relief, he saw Spike's armored vest had absorbed the worst of the plasma bolt. The mesh was blackened and flaking, but still intact. Spike squirmed weakly in Geoffrey's grasp, whimpering. But as Geoffrey cradled him close, his tail began to wag with a familiar vigor. "How you crazy little bastard," Geoffrey muttered gruffly, his voice choked with emotion. "You damn near got yourself killed." He clutched Spike tighter. "But you saved all our asses." Spike licked Geoffrey's nose, his dark eyes bright and shining in the moonlight. With a shuddering breath, Geoffrey stood, still holding Spike tight against his chest. He turned to face his team. They looked back at him, faces grim and streaked with sweat and grime. Beyond them, looming out of the jungle dark, the angular black silhouette of the Adocian facility dominated the horizon. The lights of perimeter guard towers gleamed like watching eyes in the night. Geoffrey's jaw clenched as he envisioned the small army of Adocian warriors no doubt waiting for them, weapons charged and hungry for blood. Zephyr would throw everything he had at them to keep them from the artifact. But they'd come too far to turn back now. The prize was within their reach, danger be damned. Geoffrey gave Spike one last squeeze, then gently set him down. The pup immediately took up his familiar position, pressed against Geoffrey's leg, still favoring his wounded side but standing strong and resolute. Geoffrey and his team lay prone on a rocky outcropping, the jagged stones jabbing into their guts as they surveyed the target facility through military-grade electro-binoculars. The intel had described it as secure, but as Geoffrey swept his magnified gaze over the looming structure, he mentally upgraded that assessment to fucking fortress. Squat watchtowers studded with dozens of sensors jutted from reinforced concrete walls meters thick. Squads of Adocian guards stalked the perimeter, cradling plasma rifles with an easy familiarity. And shimmering over it all was the telltale distortion of a multi-layered force field. Geoffrey grunted in agreement, mind racing. After a moment's consideration, he said, "We cloak in. With the stealth tech, we pulled off those stiffs in the forest." Riz nodded slowly. "Could work. Their sensors will be calibrated for Adocian signatures, might not pick us up." Geoffrey turned to Spike, who was pressed alertly against his side. The little dog's paw was freshly bandaged from the earlier firefight, but his dark eyes shone with stubborn eagerness. It physically pained Geoffrey, but he knew he couldn't bring Spike into the hornet's nest ahead. Geoffrey knelt and scratched Spike behind the ears, just how he liked. "Sorry, bud," he said quietly. "You gotta sit this one out. Stay here and guard our exit, yeah?" Spike whined and pawed at Geoffrey's chest, but Geoffrey stood firm. "Stay, I mean it." With a final whimper, Spike sat, ears drooping. Geoffrey turned to the team, jaw set. "Kit up and cloak on my mark." They shrugged into the salvaged Adocian stealth cloaks and activated them. To the naked eye, they simply vanished, blending in perfectly with the barren rocks. "Mark!" 5 hazy blurs detached from the outcropping and began flowing down the hillside towards the facility. They moved swiftly and silently, little more than ripples in the night air. At the shimmering wall of the force field, they paused. Geoffrey produced a compact device from his webbing and placed it almost lovingly against the energy barrier. With a few deft keystrokes, the device whirred to life, burrowing into the field's matrix like a mechanical parasite. A gap appeared, edges crackling, just wide enough for a man to pass through. Geoffrey slipped inside, the others close on his heels. As Kara brought up the rear, the device overloaded in a shower of sparks and the gap snapped closed. Geoffrey led them in a dead sprint across the open killing ground that separated the force field from the main structure. His electro-binoculars had picked out a small access hatch on this side of the building. Hopefully, Zephyr's promised subtle entrance. They flattened themselves against the wall, chests heaving. Amazingly, no alarms rang out. The cloaking tech had worked. For the moment, they were still ghosts. Geoffrey ran gloved fingers over the featureless alloy, searching for any irregularity betraying the hatch's presence. There, a near-invisible seam. He followed it until his palm top beeped softly. These were the coordinates Zephyr had provided. Geoffrey slipped a breaching charge from his belt and slapped it onto the hatch. The team braced. And then all hell broke loose. "Perimeter breach detected," a mechanized voice boomed from the watchtowers. "Intruder containment protocol initiated." A concussive boom rocked the earth beneath Geoffrey's boots. He spun to see a whole section of perimeter wall explode outward in a hail of pulverized concrete. Through the billowing dust strode a monster of black metal and malice, as tall as a house. An Idosian battle-walker. It swiveled its massive plasma cannons, barrels glowing devil-red as they took aim. "Inside now," Geoffrey roared, ripping the hatch open. The team piled through just as a storm of plasma tore through the air they'd occupied a heartbeat before. The searing bolts turned the alloy walls molten hot. Geoffrey hit the deck inside, rolled, and came up running, his men close on his heels. He consulted his palm top as he moved, following the pre-planned route to the artifact chamber. They careened around a corner and ran smack into a surprised squad of Idosian soldiers. For a single suspended moment, the two sides gaped at each other. Then Geoffrey opened fire. His rifle bucked against his shoulder as it spit armor-piercing death, his team's guns adding to the roar. The Idosians fell, blown apart in sprays of cobalt blood. But more were coming, the whole facility alerted to their presence. Boots pounded on metal floors, echoing from every direction. They pushed on, blasting their way through every knot of resistance they met, leaving sprawled blue bodies in their wake. The complex was a labyrinth, each identical corridor leading to another, but Geoffrey's palm top kept them true. At last they rounded a final corner, lungs burning and guns near empty, and there it was, the artifact chamber. But Geoffrey skidded to a halt, rifle snapping up in numb disbelief, and a sickly green force field stretched across the hallway, sealing the chamber beyond. And behind that crackling barrier stood Zephyr, flanked by a dozen of the biggest Idosian warriors Geoffrey had ever seen. Each one was a tower of honed muscle and murderous intent. "You made an admirable attempt, human," Zephyr sneered. "But you were always meant to fail. I just needed you to test this facility's security, which you have now proven is impenetrable." He smiled, a cruel slash of fangs. "And with you dead, no one else will know about the artifact, allowing my pack to study it and harness its power for ourselves." Zephyr flicked a hand at his guards, the motion oozing contempt. "Kill them." The Idosians raised their rifles eagerly. Geoffrey and his team tensed, preparing for one last futile stand. When a tiny, furry projectile came flying out of nowhere to latch onto Zephyr's face like a facehugger. Zephyr howled, rearing back and clawing at the snarling mass of teeth and fur mauling him. It was Spike. Somehow, impossibly, he'd followed them in. In the critical seconds of distraction, Geoffrey and his men exploited their opening. As one, they leveled their weapons and opened fire. Point blank on full auto, they hosed the Idosians with plasma. The aliens jerked and danced like grisly marionettes as the bolts tore through them, blasting fist-sized holes in armor and flesh alike. It was over in seconds, the hall painting a ghastly cobalt. Zephyr's elites lay sprawled in tangled heaps, twitching and oozing. With a bellow of pure rage, Zephyr ripped Spike off his ruined face and hurled him across the hall. The pup hit the far wall with a sickening crack and slid to the floor, lying still. "Drop the force field," Geoffrey commanded, voice lethally calm. "Then take us to the artifact. We're going to have a nice long chat about double crosses, and about just what makes this trinket worth stabbing me in the back for." Zephyr glared daggers but slowly raised his hands. Behind him the energy field flickered and died. Geoffrey felt a faint pressure on his leg. He looked down to see Spike, limping badly but still alive, leaning against his boot. The little dog growled at Zephyr, hackles bristling with stubborn defiance. Geoffrey smiled grimly. Against all odds, through betrayals and traps and everything else this hellish planet had thrown at them, they'd made it. The artifact, and some long-overdue answers, waited ahead. Geoffrey gestured with his rifle at the open doorway, never taking his eyes off Zephyr. Zephyr marched down the hallway, his face a resentful scowl. Jeffrey and his team followed close behind, rifles trained on the Adosian's back. Spike trotted at Jeffrey's side, ears perked and teeth bared in a smug doggy grin. The hallway opened up into a cavernous chamber. In its center, a swirling orb of what looked like liquid metal hovered in a stasis field, casting shimmering reflections on the walls. The humans halted, staring at it in awe. Zephyr turned to face them, sneering. "Behold the legacy of the Protheans, the most powerful race to ever stride across the galaxy. With this weapon, we Adosians will conquer." "Yes, spare us the evil overlord speech." Jeffrey cut him off with an eye roll. He nodded to Riz and Shen. "Start hacking that field. Kara, call our ride." As the techs moved to the control panels and Kara opened a comm channel, Zephyr edged towards a different console. In a lightning-fast move, he lunged forward and slammed a meaty fist down on a large red button. "Lockdown initiated," an automated voice announced. "Orbital bombardment commencing in T-10 minutes." Jeffrey's fist crashed into Zephyr's jaw, sending him crumpling to the floor unconscious. "Shut him up and restrain him," Jeffrey barked at Mac, rushing to the console. His fingers flew over the controls, trying to abort the sequence. "It's no good," he called, face grim. "The abort is bio-locked to Zephyr. We don't have time to hack it. We gotta evac now." "Field's down," Shen reported. Riz was already heaving the heavy artifact into a transport case. "Move out," Jeffrey ordered. "Back to the ship." Alarms blaring and lights flashing hellish red, they pelted down the corridors, Mac hauling the still limp Zephyr in a fireman's carry. A tide of Adosian soldiers boiled out from adjoining passages, plasma fire sleeting around the fleeing humans. They hit a junction, plasma bolts cracking off the walls. "Hold them here," Jeffrey shouted over the din. He snatched the case from Riz. "I'll run ahead with the package. Be right behind me." Jeffrey sprinted down the hall, the artifact case banging against his legs. Plasma bolts sizzled past his head. One clipped his calf and Jeffrey stumbled, falling hard. The case clattered away, skidding across the floor. Gritting his teeth against the searing pain, Jeffrey crawled desperately after it. But charging Adosian boots filled his vision. He looked up into a ring of plasma rifles aimed at his head. A tiny blur of fur shot out from behind a crate. Spike clamped his jaws on the case's strap and dragged it into a floor duct, the small opening just big enough for him to squeeze into. "Run, Spike!" Jeffrey bellowed. "Get out of here!" The vent cover clanged shut on Spike's tail, just as a dozen Adosian hands hauled Jeffrey to his feet. Dazed from his fall, Jeffrey could only watch as his team was herded into the junction, rifles to their heads. All bore plasma burns and rapidly purpling bruises, but the defiant snarls on their faces promised they'd go down fighting. A low chuckle drew Jeffrey's eyes. Zephyr pushed through the crowd, an ugly leer on his split-lipped face. "Looks like I've got you dead to rights, human." He spat a gob of blood. "Here's how this is going to go. You call that little furball back here with my artifact. You do that, and maybe I'll let you and your pack of primates live. If not—" He made a slashing motion across his throat. "I don't care," Zephyr roared, spittle flying from his fangs. "The artifact is all that matters. Give it to me, or I gun you down where you stand." Jeffrey glanced at the countdown on the wall. Less than 2 minutes. He met Zephyr's crazed eyes, a cold calm settling over him. "If I'm going down," Jeffrey growled, "I'm taking you with me." In a blur, Jeffrey lunged forward, ramming his fist through Zephyr's chest plate. His fingers closed around a small metal cylinder on Zephyr's belt, the detonator wired to the countdown. Jeffrey pulled Zephyr close, nose to nose, and hissed, "See you in hell." Then he crushed the detonator in his fist. The timer on the wall suddenly plummeted to 1 minute. Zephyr screamed in horrified rage. Jeffrey slammed his forehead into the Adosian's nose with a sickening crunch. Then all was chaos. Jeffrey wrenched Zephyr into the path of his soldiers' rifles, using him as a shield. His team surged forward as one, a fist slamming into an Adosian here, a rifle butt cracking into a skull there. They shoved through the disoriented guards and sprinted after Jeffrey. "Atomic sterilization in 30 seconds, the intercom blared with surreal calm. 29, 28. Jeffrey ran through the red pulsing halls, lungs and leg wound burning. His crew pounded at his heels. His mind whirled faster than his legs pumped. They sped around a corner, and there was the hatch, a rectangle of blessed starlight at the end of the tunnel. Jeffrey put his head down and ran faster than he ever had in his life. Behind them, dazed Idosians stumbled in confusion, some firing wildly, some fleeing in the opposite direction. 10, 9, 8. They leaped through the hatch, hitting the ground outside in a tangle of limbs. Jeffrey scrambled up, pulling the others to their feet. "Get to the ship, go, go!" Legs churning, they tore across the killing field, the timer echoing in their heads. 3, 2. At the last second, a small shape came pelting out of the shadows, stubby legs pumping, the artifact case bouncing behind. Spike leaped up the ramp an instant before it snapped shut. The ship lurched into the air, engines roaring. And below them, the facility erupted in a miniature sun, a seething ocean of plasma that clawed hungrily at the ship's belly as it blasted for open space. On the bridge, Jeffrey slumped to the floor, chest heaving. The battered remnants of his team sprawled around him, huffing like bellows. A cold nose poked Jeffrey's cheek. He looked up into Spike's big brown eyes, tongue lolling in a canine grin. Jeffrey wrapped his arms around the wriggling dog, burying his face in the thick fur. "You did it, buddy," he whispered. "You saved us all." Kara's voice cut through their exhausted panting. Guys, we've got a problem, a big one." Jeffrey raised his head. Out the forward viewport, an Idosian battlecruiser hung before them, as huge and ominous as a storm cloud, bristling with enough firepower to atomize them 100 times over. As he watched, a cluster of fighters detached from the behemoth, speeding towards the freighter like angry hornets. "Well, shit!" The countdown clock hit 0 just as Jeffrey and his team reached the extraction point. The facility shuddered under a relentless barrage of explosions, massive structural supports twisting and buckling. Cracks raced up walls, chunks of ceiling plummeting down in hails of debris. Jeffrey sprinted hell for leather, lungs searing, dodging falling rubble by inches. Behind him, Kara, Mac and Riz pounded at his heels, their faces contorted with desperate exertion. Ahead, the welcome sight of their dropship filled their vision, hovering with ramp extended, thrusters flaring. Jeffrey pushed his legs to pump faster, eyes locked on that rectangle of safety. Another bone-rattling explosion. The floor heaved beneath their boots like a living thing, nearly throwing them from their feet. Mac staggered, almost going down. Without breaking stride, Riz grabbed his arm and hauled him up, propelling him forward. They reached the ramp, leaping aboard. Jeffrey spun, one hand extended to help the next man up, Shen. But in that instant an ominous groan filled the air, louder than the cacophony of destruction. Jeffrey's head snapped up. A monstrous support beam, fractured by a blast, teetered directly overhead, then gave way entirely, plummeting towards them like the fist of an angry god. But it was too late. The beam crashed down in an avalanche of debris and smoke, utterly crushing Shen before he could take one more step. He vanished in a heartbeat without a sound. Jeffrey stared, features slack with shock. Dust stung his eyes, or maybe it was tears. There was no time to process, no time to grieve, only to act. He lunged back to the ramp, hauling each remaining team member aboard with a desperate strength, born of raw adrenaline. Kara, Mac, Riz. They collapsed on the deck, coughing and dazed but alive. No response, no sign of that small, fierce shadow. Jeffrey's heart clenched like a fist. Had the little dog fallen behind, been buried under rubble, succumbed to that last plasma blast? The ship bucked under another explosion, nearly throwing Jeffrey from his feet. Kara grabbed at him. "Boss, we gotta go. This whole place is coming down." Jeffrey shook her off, still peering into the inferno. He couldn't leave, not without knowing, not without... There. A tiny shape came bounding through the flames, little more than a soot-stained blur, a blackened strap clenched in its jaws. "Spike!" The puppy gathered himself, and leapt with all his strength towards the hovering ship. For a heart-stopping instant, Geoffrey saw he wasn't going to make it, momentum already failing. Geoffrey moved on pure instinct. He hurled himself out into open space, arms outstretched. His hands closed around Spike's wriggling body, clutching the dog tight to his chest as he twisted in mid-air. Geoffrey hit the ramp hard on his back and shoulders, skidding to a stop in a tangle of limbs at the feet of his astonished team. The impact blasted the breath from his lungs, but he held on tight to Spike, curling protectively around the dog. "Go!" he wheezed at the pilot. The ramp snapped shut and the ship clawed for altitude, engines howling. Thrust slammed them all flat to the deck. Geoffrey wrapped himself bodily around Spike, shielding him. The roar of explosions Dopplered away beneath them as they hurtled skyward. Geoffrey risked a glance out a tiny porthole. Below, the ruins of the facility shrank rapidly, consumed by fire. Suddenly a blinding white flash seared Geoffrey's retinas. He cried out, squeezing his eyes shut. Even through his clenched lids, the impossible brightness blazed. A millisecond later, a wall of sound hit the ship like the hammer of God. A deep wolfish howl, louder than anything Geoffrey had ever heard, rattling his bones, vibrating his very lungs. The ship bucked and yawed wildly, alarms shrieking. The shockwave. The orbital weapon had fired, vaporizing the facility, the artifact chamber, the entire region for miles, obliterating any trace of that cyclopean alien structure, and any poor bastard still inside it. The ship tumbled end over end, utterly at the mercy of the rippling devastation. Geoffrey felt his stomach lurch into his throat as gravity itself seemed to hiccup. He clung to Spike, certain they were about to be smashed to atoms. But somehow, impossibly, the ship's stabilizers and inertial dampeners clawed them back from the brink. Gradually, the bone-shaking judders gentled into shudders, then subsided entirely. The deafening roar dwindled to a dull moan, then cut off entirely. Slowly, moving like old men, Geoffrey and his team picked themselves up off the deck. They stared at each other, blinking owlishly, marveling at the fact of their own survival. Geoffrey looked down and found Spike still huddled against his chest, sides heaving. As Geoffrey watched, the pup raised his head. Solemnly, moving as if every muscle ached, Spike opened his jaws and let the artifact tumble out onto Geoffrey's lap. Geoffrey gaped. After everything, the flames, the explosions, the wild turbulence, it was still intact. Not a scorch mark or dent marred its oddly fluid surface. Spike gave a tiny, exhausted wag of his tail and promptly collapsed in Geoffrey's lap, eyes sliding shut. A laugh bubbled up in Geoffrey's chest, slightly hysterical. It burst from him in a rush, half-crazed, exultant and disbelieving at once. Oblivious, Spike began to snore, his tiny barrel chest rising and falling. Geoffrey gathered the pup up in his arms and clutched him close, burying his face in that grimy, dust-matted fur. "You crazy, brave, brilliant bastard," Geoffrey murmured, voice muffled and choked with emotion. "You just saved the whole damn galaxy." One of Spike's ears twitched. His tail gave a single feeble thump against Geoffrey's arm as if to say, "Yeah, and you thought I was just some dumb runt." Geoffrey just hugged his dog tighter as the dropship lurched into a limping trajectory towards home, the flames of a ruined world dwindling into embers behind them. The debriefing room was small and Spartan, little more than a table and chairs bolted to the floor in front of a blank vid-screen. Geoffrey shifted in his seat, the movement sending twinges of pain through his bandaged arm and face. Across from him, the three generals regarded him with stony expressions, their uniforms crisp and unblemished. Geoffrey had just finished recounting an abridged version of the mission, glossing over certain details, like the specifics of their hair-raising escape from the facility's destruction or the current whereabouts of the alien artifact. He could sense the general's dissatisfaction with his vague explanation, but he kept his own face carefully neutral. Some things were better kept close to the vest, even from superior officers. The generals leaned in, conferring in low voices too quiet for Geoffrey to catch, but he didn't miss the furtive, concerned glances they kept throwing his way. He resisted the urge to scowl. At Geoffrey's feet, Spike sat at rigid attention despite the miniature cast on his hind leg. The little dog watched the whispering generals with a cocked head and perked ears, the very picture of a dutiful soldier. But Geoffrey knew him well enough to see the subtle coiling of tension, the calculation behind those bright eyes. Suddenly, Spike stood and let out a single sharp bark that echoed off the bare walls. The generals startled in their seats, blinking at the interruption. Ignoring them, Spike trotted to the door and began pawing at it insistently, little nails clicking against the metal. He threw a meaningful glance back at Geoffrey. Smothering a grin, Geoffrey pushed himself to his feet with only a slight wince. "Guess that's our cue," he said breezily. "If there's nothing else, sirs, it's been a hell of a day." Without waiting for a dismissal, Geoffrey sketched a lazy salute that may have bordered on insubordinate. Then he limped across the room and palmed the door controls. It slid open with a hiss, and he stepped out after Spike, letting it close on the general's befuddled expressions. Geoffrey followed Spike's limping trot through the warren of corridors, noting how the little dog seemed to know exactly where he was going. Around them, the space station hummed with distant activity, but they passed no one in the halls. After a few minutes, Spike led them through a final doorway and into a small observation deck. Floor-to-ceiling viewports opened onto a breathtaking expanse of stars, the infinite black of space broken by vivid nebulas and the bright points of distant suns. Geoffrey limped to the center of the room and carefully lowered himself to one knee with a grunt. Reaching into his jacket, he withdrew a bundle of nondescript cloth and began unwrapping it. The alien artifact seemed to drink in the starlight, its quicksilver surface swirling with opalescent colors. Geoffrey felt the skin on the back of his neck prickle just looking at it. "Well, buddy," Geoffrey said quietly, "I think we both know what we have to do." "Don't worry, I know a guy who can stash this thing somewhere safe," Geoffrey reassured him. "Somewhere no one, human or Idosian, will ever find it." "I get it. Part of me wants to hand it over to the eggheads, too, see what technological marvels they could cook up from it. But you and I both know that'd just be asking for another Zephyr to come along and try to weaponize the damn thing again." Spike huffed out a breath, head and tail drooping. But then he seemed to come to a decision. Squaring his little shoulders, Spike met Geoffrey's gaze, a new resolve hardening in his eyes. Geoffrey felt an answering grin tug at his mouth. "Attaboy, we do this, then we disappear. Go to ground, live out our lives somewhere no one knows our names or what we did." At that, Spike's tail gave a tentative wag. Encouraged, Geoffrey reached into his pocket and pulled out a scuffed tennis ball. Spike's eyes immediately locked onto it, his whole body lifting into an alert crouch. Geoffrey chuckled. "But first, I'd say we've earned a little R&R, wouldn't you?" Drawing his good arm back, Geoffrey sent the ball rocketing down the corridor outside the observation deck. Spike scrambled after it with a gleeful bark, cast thumping rhythmically against the floor. Shaking his head fondly, Geoffrey pushed himself back to his feet with a wince. He turned to follow Spike, but paused in the doorway, looking back. The artifact lay on the floor behind him, a small, unassuming shape that had caused so much destruction. Geoffrey felt a chill ripple through him despite himself. Grimacing, he hit the control panel beside the door. The observation viewport spiraled shut with a thunk, entombing the artifact in darkness. In the hall, Spike came galloping back with the ball clenched triumphantly in his jaws. Geoffrey smiled and crouched down, ignoring the protestations of his battered body. "All right, you little hero," he said, scooping up the ball and his dog. "Let's find some place to crash." He tucked Spike into the crook of his good arm, tennis ball and all. "And I think I owe you the biggest stake in the galaxy." The transport shuttle shuddered as it settled onto the dingy landing pad with a pneumatic hiss. Geoffrey hefted his duffel bag over his shoulder, his arm twinging with the motion. Spike bounded down the ramp ahead of him, tongue lolling and tail wagging, cast free and full of energy. They wove their way through the bustling spaceport, a riot of color and sound. Insectoid wracks haggled over spare parts. Reptilian saurians shouldered past with blaster rifles, and a gaggle of furry Droxians jabbered in their high-pitched language. Geoffrey scanned the crowd with a wary eye, but saw no sign of the distinctive blue skin and yellow eyes of Idosians. The cab lifted off, merging into the chaotic traffic. Spike stood with his paws on the door, nose pressed to the window, as he drank in the sights. After a dizzying series of turns down narrow, shadowy streets, the cab settled to the ground. Geoffrey swiped his cred strip, and they hopped out under the red glare of the bloated sun. A distant howl rose over the city din, setting Spike's ears a-quiver. He pressed close to Geoffrey's leg. Geoffrey rested a calming hand on the dog's head as he eyed the weathered cantina entrance. Shouldering through the swinging doors, they were hit with a blast of smoke, cheap booze and body odor. The patrons, a motley assortment of mercs, smugglers and other fringe dwellers, barely spared them a glance. Just another down-on-his-luck spacer and his mutt. Geoffrey spotted his contact in a dim back booth and slid in across the table. Spike crawled under his feet. With a subtle motion, Geoffrey passed the man a data chit. Nodding almost imperceptibly, the contact deftly pocketed it and produced one of his own, sliding it across the sticky table. Geoffrey palmed it, gave a curt nod, and the man drained his glass and left without a word. Spike's head popped up beside Geoffrey's knee, ears perked inquisitively. Geoffrey gave them a covert scratch. "New IDs and a lead on a place we can lay low out on the rim," he murmured. "Won't be a cushy life, but it'll be ours." Spike's tail thumped against the floor in approval. Geoffrey gave the room one last sweep for unfriendly eyes, then jerked his head toward the back door. They slipped out into the alley, then onto the dusty street. "Easy, bud," Geoffrey muttered. "You're getting jumpy as me. We'll be out of this sardine can soon." But as they passed between two sputtering streetlights, Geoffrey's danger sense screamed to life. In a single fluid motion, he drew his concealed blaster and spun, dropping to one knee. A familiar blue-skinned figure stepped forward, lips curled in a leering grin. Geoffrey's heart sank. "Zephyr," he spat. "Surprised to see me, human?" Zephyr smirked. "You didn't really think a little orbital strike could do me in, did you?" "Ah, and the mongrel sidekick. Good, I have a score to settle with him too." Zephyr leveled his sidearm at the snarling terrier. Geoffrey's mind raced. Even if he got a shot off at Zephyr, the others would put them both down in a hail of plasma. But damned if he wasn't going to go down swinging. Geoffrey's finger tightened on the trigger, Zephyr's aim never wavering from Spike. The standoff stretched taut as a tripwire. Suddenly the night erupted in a blaze of light and a cacophony of sound. Geoffrey flinched, expecting to be vaporized, but it was the Idosians who howled in agony, reeling and staggering like drunks. Realization hit Geoffrey like a hammer. Sensory overload grenades designed to scramble Idosian senses. Seizing the moment, Geoffrey lunged forward, scooping a discarded plasma rifle and then Spike, tucking the squirming dog under one arm as he sprinted for the alley mouth. Skidding to a stop, Geoffrey cast about wildly, hope and desperation warring in his chest. Movement above caught his eye, and his heart soared. A battered cargo hauler descended to hover over the street, ramp lowered. And crouched there, grinning like maniacs, were the beautiful bastards Geoffrey called his team. Geoffrey surged forward, legs pumping, Spike football tucked against his chest. One final lunge and a heave from Riz, and he was tumbling into the hold. The ship lurched skyward before the ramp even sealed, the wind of their passage ripping at Geoffrey's hair. He hit the deck, rolling to absorb the impact. Spike squirmed free, yapping excitedly. As Geoffrey lay gulping air, giddy laughter bubbled up his throat. His team, his band of beautiful misfits, had come through again. "You meatheads better have grabbed my speeder," Geoffrey called in mock affront. Kara smirked, jerking a thumb at a tarp-shrouded lump in the corner. "Who you think you're dealing with, boss?" Chuckling breathlessly, Geoffrey pushed to his feet, Spike cradled in his arms. He moved to the viewport, watching the dusty city dwindle to a speck below. "Well, buddy," he murmured to the panting terrier, "guess that quiet life will have to wait, huh?" He glanced around at his crew, at the determined set of their jaws and the battle light in their eyes. What do you say we take the fight to Zephyr and his scaly pals? Make the galaxy a little safer for folks like us. Spike met his gaze and gave a single firm bark. A smile tugged at Jeffrey's mouth. Damn right, let's get to work. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, searing the bulkheads of the Adosian Dreadnought's bridge. Jeffrey and his team crouched behind sparking consoles, pouring suppressing fire into the onrushing horde of snarling Adosian warriors. Spike darted between Jeffrey's legs, a blur of teeth and claws. The little dog's jaws snapped shut on the ankle of an Adosian, razor-sharp ceramic fangs punching through armor weave like it was tissue paper. The alien went down with a shriek, and Spike was already pouncing on the next, an unstoppable furry missile. Jeffrey risked a glance at the shimmering portal at the center of the bridge. Inside, a swirling orb of obsidian energy pulsed with malevolent purpose, the key to the Adosians' planet killer, the thing they'd fought so hard and lost so much to reach. Last mag, Riz called over the din, slamming home a fresh magazine into his rifle. Make it count, Jeffrey barked back, dropping an Adosian with a plasma bolt between its eyes. They were badly outnumbered. Jeffrey could see it in the sweat-streaked faces of his team, in the bloody rents in their armor. But he could also see the iron resolve, the unflinching loyalty. His brothers and sister in arms would see this through to the bitter end. The gunfire lulled for a heartbeat. Jeffrey locked eyes with each of his team, no words needed. As one, they nodded. It was time. As one, the team swung their rifles up and hosed the huge Transpler's windows with searing plasma bolts. The reinforced material shuddered, then shattered into a million glittering shards. Explosive decompression ripped through the bridge like a hurricane. Screeching Adosians were plucked off their feet and sucked out into the pitiless void, limbs pinwheeling. But Jeffrey and his team had already maglocked their boots, anchoring them to the deck plates. They kept up the withering fusillade, cutting down the disoriented survivors. "Jeffrey, go!" Kara shouted over the screaming wind. "We'll cover you!" Jeffrey didn't hesitate. He charged across the bucking deck, Spike bounding at his heels. Reaching the portal, he snatched a breaching charge from his webbing and slapped it onto the pulsing orb. The adhesive bonded instantly. Carrying his comm to broadcast over the team's dedicated channel, Jeffrey roared, "All right, you glorious bastards. Let's give these scaly vultures something to really fear." Scooping up Spike and tucking him football-style under one arm, Jeffrey sprinted for the gaping hole where the viewports used to be. Behind him, his team whooped and hollered like madmen, firing from the hip as they fell in at his heels. Together they leaped out into the howling void. Jeffrey felt the dizzying wrench of sudden weightlessness, the icy blast of hard vacuum. Far below, the curved expanse of the planet loomed, a mottled ball of oranges and reds. Twisting in freefall, Jeffrey thumbed the breaching charge's detonator. The Adosian Dreadnought vanished in a sun-bright flash, a new star birthing in the night sky. A millisecond later the sound hit them, a deep, concussive thump Jeffrey felt in his bones. The shockwave caught them like a giant fist, flinging them end over end. Shrapnel whickered past, pinging off Jeffrey's armor. He felt several hammer blows to his back and legs, the impacts nearly causing him to black out. He clung grimly to Spike, pulling the dog tight to his chest. He felt Spike lick his chin, the pup strangely calm in the midst of the maelstrom. Jeffrey forced his eyes open, searching desperately for his team. He caught glimpses of familiar armor tumbling amid the glittering debris, Riz, Kara, Mac. But with a sinking heart, Jeffrey saw they were limp and unmoving, tethers severed. Pain suddenly spiked through Jeffrey's shoulder, so intense it blotted out his vision. He couldn't stop the scream that ripped from his throat. Instinctively, his grip on Spike loosened. The pup started to slip from his grasp, twisting away into the void. But at the last second, Spike lunged and snagged Jeffrey's armored chestplate in his teeth. Spike clung with all his tiny might, stubbornly refusing to let go. Together, man and dog plunged into the upper atmosphere, trailing smoke and fire like a comet. The wind roared past Jeffrey's helmet, an unending howl of sound. It almost sounded like screaming. the screams of every being this terrible war had claimed, human and Edosian alike, the universe itself seeming to grieve. With a titanic effort, Jeffrey forced his uninjured arm to move, scrabbling weakly at his grav-chute release. But the G-forces pressing him flat were too strong. He couldn't reach it. The rocky ground was rushing up to meet them at terminal velocity. Jeffrey felt a strange sense of peace descend over him. He gathered Spike to his chest, shielding his friend with his own broken body. The impact was tremendous, like the hammer of God striking the planet. It blasted a crater in the rock, throwing up a geyser of pulverized stone. At the heart of the impact, a shattered man cradled a broken dog. Spike's only reply was to lick Jeffrey's face, his stubtail wagging ever so slightly. Then the little dog laid his head on Jeffrey's chest and closed his eyes. As Jeffrey slipped into the black, he thought he noticed something curious. All around them the clamor of battle seemed to be quieting, the chatter of gunfire petering out, shouted Edosian commands fading to silence. As if, in this single moment between life and death, the universe was holding its breath, considering, choosing perhaps a different path than ruin. A final hope, a desperate plea cast like a flare into the infinite night. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.